You're listening to the Yeshiva of Newark at IDT podcast. I'm your host and curator, Rabbi Kivlevitz, and I hope you enjoy this episode.
Clear the aisles, the projectionist has Semicha. Hi, I'm here with Kolakowski, and we're here to darshan about old movies and vintage TV, and I think we got a little bit of both. Not too old though. Actually, I think we're both going to talk about movies that are products of a period known as the Cold War, and movies that feature, at least I think we're going to talk about, the Russians as sort of like the other side of the coin. Now today, of course, Yitzchak, we can't stop hearing about Russia. War crimes, Putin, barbarism, images that are coming out of those places, video and still photography that's really incredibly harrowing and terrible. And we have to, I guess it's hard for many of the young people today to remember how the Russians were the boogeyman for so long. I mean, you definitely had known as the Red Chinese, but Hollywood, along with television, realized that the Russians were indeed they were our nemesis in many ways, and we were worried about mutual destruction. But there developed, at least in the films, there was films that really were a product of the Cold War, where the good guy Americans had to perhaps make the world safe against the intrusion of communism. But it's funny, Yitzchak, that so many films actually sort of stayed away from painting the Russians as the ultimate bad guys. I mean, Reagan, everybody knows about Reagan referring to the Russians as the evil empire. But in Hollywood, I'm sure we have films with the Russians as the boogeyman. But I actually want to talk about some films where the Russians and Americans, there was actually a sort of like an equation between the Russian and Americans. It's true, the Russians were perhaps seen as much more militaristic and maybe a tad more aggressive. But there's a number of films that actually posited the Russians almost as sort of our mirror image. And I think there's no film that really, brings that out as well as a sort of little obscure film that gets a little bit of play on TCM and other places, called The Double Man. It's based on a 1958 what this film is that it stars as the CIA sort of super agent who is being targeted by the Russians, Yul Brynner. And Yul Brynner, who sort of, you figure he had a career playing heavies, playing Pharaoh in the Ten Commandments, and even I guess sort of really like Oriental or characters that were from the other world, not necessarily Oriental in terms of what we call Chinese or Korean, but rather from that other part of the world. Films where, like Taras Bulba, where he played this Cossack, Mongol, gypsy characters. That's sort of what he was about, and that's where he was from. But in this film, he plays like an American guy. His name is Dan Slater, and shaved head and all. And of course, it's a little bit of spoiler here. I don't know. We should start saying spoiler alerts again. I don't know. They do that in a lot of the other podcasts about movies. Spoiler alert. But it's really not much of a spoiler, because it's called The Double Man, and and you sort of get these very heavy-handed hints that Dan Slater, this Yul Brynner's character, is going to be pushed into a Russian plot to investigate the very violent death of his son in a ski resort in the Austrian Alps. And when he goes there, they have plotted something for years, knowing exactly how the way he thinks, this cold, ruthless super spy who basically doesn't trust anything, but they've gotten it worked out that they will lead him through sort of a little bit of a honey trap, but into a situation where they will be able to replace him with a double who is also, of course, played by Yul Brynner, who has studied totally and completely all his habits, and then he'll go back to the United States in tow with the CIA agent out of Zurich, and that guy will then bring him back and then to Washington, and this way he's just going to obviously cause havoc with a Russian mole in the upper echelon of power. So that's really basically the plot. Now, what's interesting is that Yul Brynner, although he could be quite expressive, I still remember his sort of even in the Ten Commandments, you sort of get Rachmanis for him a little bit. In The King and I, which of course was the film that he won an Oscar for, you see a certain character arc and a certain development as a human being. In this film, he is a cold, ruthless type of person. And the film makes a great point of saying that even, it's true, maybe the world will fall into the Russian hands more if he gets replaced. But this guy that they're replacing him with is sort of pretty much the same sort of evil son of a bee as he is, right? At least in the sense of being, because why was his son in the Alps? Was because he couldn't raise his son. Because this 16-year-old boy, or however old he was, 16 or 15, however old he was, really didn't feel like he could be loved and raised, or supposedly for his own protection. He was sent there under the care of one of Dan Slater's former MI5 British compatriots, who is now since retired and running some sort of school, international school for kids from Europe and from America that happen to be able to go there. Clive Revill plays this part, and he's probably the standout actor, I would say, in this film. The Russian people who are plotting this are pretty much, I looked them up on when I was doing a little research here. I think some of those are character actors that played Nazis and no goodniks continuously throughout the 50s and 60s. But he doesn't even, when he comes to the funeral, they've started the funeral without him. And, he comes late and, he doesn't have anything to say. So it's clear that this is a fellow who has a lot of issues. His wife has died, but he's someone who trusts no one. He's someone who sort of realizes that trap is being set, but he feels he could somehow get out of it. The film has two other stars I should mention. One of them is Lloyd Nolan. And Lloyd Nolan, of course, had a very big career in Hollywood playing character parts and on television. And he plays, for some reason, and I don't know if he was somehow at that time, suffering from a broken leg or something, Lloyd Nolan plays his character in a wheelchair. And that he's the head of the CIA, and he's sort of on the phone trying to make sure that a trap isn't really being set, and let's get Slater back out of there. The honey trap, with a character that you sort of wonder, is she in on it? Is she not in it? Are the Russians using her? Is played by the very beautiful Britt Eklund, who at that point I think was married to Peter Sellers. And she eventually made a number of films with him. In this film, she doesn't, although she was later a Bond girl, I think in The Spy Who Loved Me. In this film, she doesn't go all Bond girl, meaning, as this incredible luscious piece of cheesecake. Although you can tell, there's a number of references to how beautiful she is, and she actually has a certain sort of innocence in this film, a sort of schoolgirl innocence, despite the fact that she's obviously a mature woman. And she is somehow the one who can lead Slater to because she was on the slopes or going up on the in the car that takes them up, in the cable car that takes them up to the top of this treacherous mountain. There is a lot of wonderful shots of people skiing. It was filmed on location. Fortunately, they had when they have to show Yul Brynner, who's supposedly an expert skier, skiing after Britt It's one of these back projection shots where you could tell there was a guy sitting there. They were sitting in the studio, and in the back of them they were just projecting in the back the snow bank. It's done really in a way that's quite embarrassing and amateurish, and even where they're supposed to, he is supposed to fall. You can tell that it's some stunt man with a shaved head. It's not Yul Brynner. In fact, even the fight scenes, although Brynner was quite he was an acrobat when he was growing up, and he was known to be a very, very physically fit fellow, despite having a couple of accidents happen to him. In this film, you can see that you can see where in the fight scenes, even not where he's fighting his double, that it's clearly a stunt person doing. And I was a little bit disappointed on that. But the film was, as I said, it was made in 1967, and many people have commented on it. That was very similar in tone to a lot of what was happening in television at that time. And we know that, of course, television was very much influenced in some ways by the Bond phenomena that sort of took off like a rocket ship, in 1962. But Bond, of course, was, this suave super spy who clearly was much better than his antagonists. Here, that's not the case. However, I should point out, as you know, that even the second Bond film, From Russia with Love, which some people see as the best film, really indicates that Bond isn't going to be fighting the Cold War, although he's sort of like a Cold War spy. He's really fighting against a super evil umbrella organization, which is worse than the Americans and the Russians and the English Spectre, which sort of like is this puppet master manipulating everything. And I think you find a similar thing in the Bond knockoff television program, The Man from U.N.C.L.E., where you also have, I think, Thrush. I think and of course in the satirical Comedic Get Smart, you have Chaos, right? So, right, all of those things, as I think I told you before when we were once talking about it, it's like we're afraid to zero in on the Russians, like the Russians themselves. And this is really part of what Double Man indicates, that you can have a Russian guy being the CIA guy. The Russian guy takes him over. In fact, when they're fighting, he says, there can only be one of us, which sort of gets back to this theme that the Cold War is taking its toll on us. I mean, Jean Le Carré, of course, made a career out of showing the ugly side of what the Cold War was doing to the operatives, that the noble sort of give up your life, do anything for the sake of the country. He showed that in Tinkle Tailor Soldier Spy, and in The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. I mean, that was basically a whole genre of sort of anti glorifying the cause, to say that, well, maybe it's true, democracy is definitely better than communism, but at what cost? There's this secret service or CIA or whatever it is that's all involved in black operations that have sullied all those protagonists, to the point that among themselves they're as black as their enemies, despite what they're saying about the cause that they're fighting for. And I think that the film, The Double Man, actually, when Yul Brynner Slater says, you'll never be able to pull it off, you'll never be able to convince, because you can't duplicate a human. And the answer from this fellow who the mastermind of the Russian plot says, well, what, you think that there's something called a soul? A soul that's something that people have been sold. No pun intended there. That basically, if you can, Pavlov has proven that if you're able to mimic or emulate a person's reactions to things and learn them, that's all that a person is really a person is a living being who reacts to stimuli, and then that builds up and becomes the habit that forms what a person is, which is really, in a way, I guess, what the film is actually suggesting. Obviously, we come from two different cultures, but is there really something inherently greater in one culture than the other? Are we able to channel that aspect of soul? And the film, although Clive Revill, who has thrown away the mantle of being a spy and really is very against that whole world, finds himself drawn into it. And he is the one who is put into a position at the very end of the film where he needs to make a choice between the two, the Russian Kalmar and Slater. You have two Yul Brenners. Which one is he going to shoot? What's interesting is that he can't tell the difference. He's not sure. And Slater, the one that we know who Slater says, shoot us both. You have to. That's the only thing you can do is shoot us both. And he makes a choice. And the film, although it leaves it somewhat ambiguous. I mean, I'll let if our listeners want to see it, you can let us know what you think. There is a sense of ambiguity. Who is the one he shot, and perhaps a question as to whether it really made a difference. So that is really an interesting film. I just want to say one more point about the film. I said it was somewhat amateurish in the way it was presented, and it's interesting because it was an Academy Award director, Franklin J. Schaffner, who won an Oscar for Patton, and of course was the director of another classic film, which I think you must like. It's called Planet of the Apes, right? Which spawned a whole. It became a whole series of films that spawned, and of course, Franklin J. Schaffner, seems to have been a director. The battle scenes in Patton, and of course the big reveal scene in Planet of the Apes of where the astronauts really are. And he also directed a number of, he was supposedly a very innovative director for things that he did in the 50s for Playhouse 90. So it's interesting that this film sort of, although some of like I said, the scenery and the action is somewhat interesting going on the cable cars, he doesn't seem to have found his stride. But when I was thinking about it, the theme itself is somewhat similar. I mean, Patton, although it really, talks about, it's really a biopic, but it really is able to expose a lot of George C. Scott's playing Patton, a lot of Patton's ugliness. And, it sort of does, although I don't think the film was a glorification of war, Patton. Obviously, you're rooting for the Americans, but again, even in Patton, I think there is somewhat of an equation between the two sides, and Planet of the Apes as well. Really, is also a film that sort of bursts the bubble of the noble astronaut who's trying to explore, right? And clearly, as everybody knows, I don't think it's a spoiler to know what happened. That somehow the apes have taken over the planet. I think it's also really these films that Schaffner made.
It wasn't the original story. If you ever read the original book,
it was Pierre Boulez, right? Pierre Boulez, right?
Yeah, in the Boulez novel, the astronaut goes back to Earth to find that the apes had taken over Earth. He did go to another planet and then came back to Earth to discover what had happened to Earth. So it was a similar story, but it wasn't. Whereas here it was, they just wound up on Earth,
Right, but I think if you take these three films and another film that Schaffner made, The Boys from Brazil, right, which really talks about, it was based on the Ira Levin book where they're trying to create Hitler. And, again, it really, I think all these films, Schaffner seems to be in, he really is operating in shades of gray. Because, of course, in that film, they're trying to produce Hitler they've cloned Hitler, and they're trying to reproduce the Fuhrer by making sure to kill off his father at a certain age, and they tried to place those kids in the type of homes that were similar in terms of the nurture that created the monster known as Hitler. So again, the film sort of is indicating that who knows how we become. It isn't necessarily that you have this demonic human, right? But you can actually, but perhaps other forces can make that happen, and who knows if they're going to happen or not. And so I think there's sort of like again, I can't go through this whole filmography, but it seems like Schaffner was, he seems like he had sort of like a definitely a tempered vision. I don't think he was actually, as much as people love Patton. I know Ronald Reagan wanted, he felt that he could have been offered the role, and he always said he'd love to have played Patton. I think all of those films, were really somewhat subversive, and none of them more so than The Double Man. So
I think the interesting thing is the level is that, do we have any Russian movies, Soviet movies that made that same moral equivalency? I don't know. I'm not an expert in.
That's a very good question. I mean, I know that we talked in the past about even some of the Nazi films, right? And I think the beauty of those films, we did a program, if you remember, about that when we talked about Cabaret and some of those Nazi films, of what they're able. It would be interesting to note whether the stuff the Soviets were cranking out, were more, let's say, less subtle in terms of positing the Americans as these, nefarious colonialists who just wanted to exploit the worker, and which is what, of course, they said. Of course, they wanted to set up a situation of fat cats that were running things. I think maybe we should also, reckon in that Hollywood and was probably hoping that in some way they could maybe market these films in the Eastern Bloc. I don't know.
We're dealing with that now in China,
right?
That, Hollywood is scared to death to offend China, and they're in some way complicit with a lot of the atrocities going on in China right now.
Well, yeah. Well, put it this way: the bottom line is always money, and I think that the Bond films, and possibly even this film, although I don't think it made much money, they might have had that in their minds, that maybe it could show in other places in Germany, and perhaps maybe even the Soviet Union as well. They could probably work something out, and they didn't want to close off a market. And we talked about, of course, how even in the 1930s, as the Nazi regime was already quite apparently a threat and a danger to all democracy, they were still making films that they hoped would be accepted in Germany, and didn't want to offend them by having too much sympathy for the Jewish plight. So there's no it's possible. It's all Schaffner isn't just a thinker, but he might be listening to what his Hollywood honchos are telling him. Although this film was, I think, made in Britain, but funded by whatever Warner Brothers that I think was behind it, that they actually were happy about this sort of thing, because this way they weren't closing things off. But I know you have actually, I've given you a lot of touch points here, because I know what you're going to be talking about. And a number of the actors and people that I've mentioned have a tremendous relevance to the film. I think that you want to recommend as sort of like an example of that Cold War craziness. So why don't you go ahead?
Again, and again, it's going away from, because I know you love very much. I've seen it 2 or 3 times, and one of the times I saw it was actually on the big screen, because the TCM has a program with Fathom Events. Just about once a month, they broadcast movies live into movie theaters, so you can see on a very big screen, probably bigger than by that time, there was CinemaScope and everything, so you did have those big screens. But some of the movies that they show, certainly the older movies from the 30s and early 40s were not on such big screens, but they're not showing as many of those movies as they were. But I did get to see this movie from the 1960s, the Dr. Strangelove, or how I learned to stop worrying and love the bomb,
right,
on the big screen, thanks to TCM.
But why don't you talk a little bit about why you love Strangelove?
Well, I mean, you and I were both discussing about this. I think we can agree that was Kubrick's greatest film, his really his masterpiece. was one of his first. It wasn't his first. He made quite a few before that.
Yeah, look, you have The Killing, which is really a great film that he made in the 50s about a heist gone wrong. But yeah, that was.
Was before that also. There was a few that were before that, but it was. I think as far as I can remember, it's the only one of his films that I've actually made it through. I tried to watch 2001 a few times, and I'm a big science fiction buff. I just could not make it through that movie. It takes a lot of patience to make it through 2001. I remember Rabbi Weinberger saying, "Oh, it's a very hush of a movie." I remember in high school there was, and I said, I couldn't make it through it. It was.
Yeah, well, look, 2001, you really have to see it also on the big screen and just let it pour over you. Strangelove hits the ground running with comedic power and
the whole time.
Yeah,
it doesn't stop.
Right. It's riveting. It's a riveting film and extremely funny. Like I'm saying, it's extremely funny, and the humor I think has held up even today. But Look, Kubrick, you have to understand, Yitzchak was primarily, and he was a Life magazine photographer. He was a cinematographer. To him, the image was everything, crafting the image. Unlike Schaffner, who's sort of a hack in that way, Kubrick wanted everything set up, just right. A Jewish guy out of New York, a real, part of that New York Jewish Renaissance of the 40s and 50s. Of intellectuals and writers and thinkers and people that were involved in plays and films. That was that's where Kubrick comes out of, and Strangelove, really those images are really so jarring and so unique. The war room, right? Just the way that war room was set up. I mean, everybody knows the last shot, spoiler alert, of course. And but even you talk about, the use, we'll talk about Sellers in a minute, the husband of Britt Eklund in a minute. And how Kubrick wanted him to play even more characters than he did. He was supposed to also play the Slim Pickens character, but talk a little bit about some of those people that Kubrick.
And that's really, really quite a,
yes,
major thing. Even though he was a rather minor character in the film, he's become a big star, and he really showed himself. He showed his chops there in this film.
Right, he's actually one of the. In case you don't realize, the film is really about a tragic mistake that really could be the end of the world, because
it is.
It is. Well, with nuclear fallout.
Much of a spoiler. I think most people know what
right. So, but at least the basic plot of the film is, for people who don't know what Strangelove is, it's that a sort of deranged army colonel, specifically who's at NORAD's command, I guess out in the West somewhere, has specifically coded the planes to attack the Russians and drop a bomb on some major city in Russia, which they know will immediately result in retaliation. And then the conceit of the film is, which it shared with the other film that sort of has the almost exact same plot, but was done not as a comedy, but as a real stark drama, Failsafe, based on the book by Fletcher Knubel. It was that there is a certain time where you can't call the planes back because there was a fear that the radio connection might be actually a subterfuge. So they had to assume that once they were given that they couldn't be called back, because you have to be worried that maybe the Russians had somehow gotten into our method of communication. And therefore, you sort of you ignore all commands, even if they sound like they're coming from the president. That's sort of like the fail-safe area where it's too late. And once they're out, they're going to be out no matter what. And it's the American strike first, which results in the Russian retaliation, then you have the mutual destruction. So that has occurred.
And also in this movie, so the Russians had a new type of bomb that would be a doomsday device, and that was really part of the
that they were going to unleash, that would basically destroy right. It wasn't just as in Failsafe where, we took out Moscow, whatever city it was, and they take out New York, and then there's going to be perhaps the nuclear fallout. But there's actually this device that could perhaps even do much more damage, making the whole planet inhospitable, and everybody would have to live underground if they could survive at all. But it's really done. Really,
it seemed that they would survive underground at that point. I mean, I know they were discussing that, and the animals to be bred and slaughtered, and they'd have to, they spoke about how, monogamy would have to go out the window for the sake of preserving the race.
Again, that is really, again, you're sort of, that's really, Peter Sellers' tour de force speech at the very end of the film, where you realize that the ultimate bad guys here is Strangelove, because, Peter Sellers, before we get them, let's talk about before we get to Peter Sellers playing all these parts. We talk about, again, George C. Scott, who was, who had sort of, I think one of his first films was Anatomy of a Murder, which was a couple of years earlier to that, where, and then I think he was also in The Hustler as well. I think this film, before he played in Patton, which, as I mentioned earlier before, he plays this, Buck Turgidson, this, gung-ho general who sort of has figured all this out and is in some ways happy that the mistake has occurred, and then maybe we could ride this out, and we could deal with the casualties, and this way we'll win the war, even though we're going to knock off how much of the planet. And that is quite, he's a comedic figure in terms of his ruthlessness. The Colonel, Jack T. Ripper, is of course played by someone that Kubrick used in the 50s, was known as almost the ultimate tough guy of the 50s, Sterling Hayden, who was in a number of classic film noirs besides The Killing, and also had a memorable part in The Godfather. But Sterling Hayden, he was a perfect choice to play somebody extremely serious but obviously off their rocker. And
he was the one he was worried about the
fluoride.
And his precious bodily fluids. And
yes, and Sterling Hayden, again, to a T, just playing it perfectly, in this insane romp. Those two are really standouts, Sterling Hayden and George C. Scott. And then, of course, you have Sellers, who plays not only the president as the most mousy, milquetoast character.
It's just incredible. I always, it's always an incredible thing to hear a British person do an American accent. I remember one of my Rebbeim in yeshiva was Rabbi Yaakov Usher Sinclair, who himself had a background in Hollywood, and he did this one speech, talking, kind of making fun of an American movie, actor, receiving an award, and how arrogant these award ceremonies are things. and he said he made this whole speech with an American accent, and then one of the Bachram, he said, why don't British people just talk like that all the time? Why do we have to put up with these British accents?
Well, the Hollywood is full of a history of Brits who have come over here and made a career out of using American accents. They seem to be able to do it much better than we can do the other thing. You have Vivian Leigh. Even Liz Taylor really came to the United States with a British accent. which she still had, tinges of it as well. Hugh Laurie in television, of course.
Laurie, I was thinking about, yeah.
Right. Hugh Laurie is can do it perfectly, but you really go through, the pages of Hollywood's greatness. I mean, we talked about Errol Flynn last week. He was an Australian, but he could pretty much remove his Australian accent to sound like, I guess any American.
Also, Mel Gibson. You don't hear this.
Mel Gibson, also in Australia, but again, and Charlize Theron. I mean, again, the list is almost endless of characters like that. But I think the point is that he doesn't just do the accent; he captures such an American mentality. Supposedly, seemingly a good person, but obviously incompetent, who doesn't really understand things, somehow became elected president, but needs everything to be explained to him. And it's just
the character reminds me very much of like Principal Skinner on The Simpsons.
Okay,
that type of
could be. I actually see him as more, perhaps in the fact that things were going awry and out of control, and he was trying to feel that he was doing something. But he when he's talking, even the Bob Newhart shtick of talking on the phone and making you believe what the other person is saying, and you can, Kubrick does a little bit of the voice you can hear on the other side of the phone, but just the way he's reacting is perfect. Now, besides playing the president, he also plays a British RAF officer who is attached to the base where Jack the Ripper is. And of course, there's something going on over there where they're trying to, they've boarded up the base, so none of the rest of the standard armed forces can stop what's going on, right? And so he does a great job playing that British fellow, and then the last couple of minutes, of course, he Sellers is Strangelove himself. And I think part of what they did, I'm not sure if this was in the book at all, that Sellers plays a Nazi, right? He plays a Nazi who has been, and this was really, Kubrick's criticism, and maybe it was in the book itself, as I would say, that we pilfered the Nazis, who were these evil, demonic forces who wanted to really enslave and eliminate so much of the world population, and we just wanted to get their brains, to get their scientists like Werner von Braun and others, and that's sort of what Sellers was channeling there. And
I was thinking of Tom Lehrer's song about Werner von Braun.
Yes, and that clearly, when Sellers, he's this example of, he's sitting there in the war room as one of the most trusted people in the U.S., and he's somebody that was part of a regime that really was terrible. And I think that's part of the horror and comedy of that film. And the role that he wasn't able to play, because I think Sellers had in preparation of playing this Western cowboy, and it would have been great to see Sellers do that. It would have been, he hurt his back, and because of that, Kubrick put out a call to this, to an Andy Devine type fellow who was in just a regular that was in a number of Westerns, playing just, aw shucks, like the old cowhand. It's Slim Pickens. And, Slim Pickens is in that role. I forgot what his name is, Yitzchak. Is, Major King Kong, right? And he is, and Keenan Wynn, always a fine addition to any film, as Colonel Bat Guano. So, you really have Jack the Ripper, King Kong, Bat Guano, even Buck Turgidson, because it's clearly that the thing that interests him most, besides killing off the Russians, is being involved with these women, which is where we see him in the very beginning of the film, turgid being the key word there. So it really is a classic. And although the Cold War, I think, has sort of receded in people's minds, and the idea of mutual destruction, but with Putin threatening again, right? That who knows what sort of bombs he might unleash. I think that it's I think
when I turn on the news and on the internet, and they're telling us, it's almost doing the old Duck and Cover cartoon. They're redoing it now, telling us how you're going to survive a nuclear war, how you're going to survive the fallout. You have to wash your clothes and cover yourself up and not look at, and like all these, and these are things that I was, I mean, you grew up more when it was much more pertinent, but it was a fear that I had throughout my childhood of nuclear war. And now I remember just very distinctly having all kinds of nightmares about nuclear war as a child. And it was something I was very, very frightened of. And now that this has come back again, this specter has come back, and it's something we never expected, the way something we haven't seen in Europe, I would say, other than the invasion of Hungary, when Hungary tried to
and Czechoslovakia, Czechoslovakia, and again, people
and Yugoslavia, Milosevic,
and Chechen. The Chechen massacres that are happening there. I think here it's expanded in a way that perhaps dwarfs even those periods, especially the access that we have to television and cell phones, where so many of those images have come back. I don't know if Strangelove or Doubleman is any sort of antidote to any of this, but I think it's it definitely you have this thing of
I mean, the frightening thing is that when we were fighting communism, we were fighting an ideology, and this we're fighting just plain barbarism. Like, what exactly is happening here? This is something that's so difficult to understand. It's not when we were fighting the Nazis, we knew we were fighting the most evil ideology imaginable. When we were fighting the communists, we were fighting an ideology that wound up killing more innocent people than the Nazis did. And now we're not fighting. We're sitting back watching something happen, anticipating when are we going to fight. We're kind of, in 1939, 1940, waiting for the World War, not knowing where, or even, before World War One, looking at, it's much more of a World War One type of a situation where, it's much more baffling. I mean, it's very clear that Putin is not only the aggressor, but is very clearly evil. Although I guess there are some people questioning that, but to me, it seems rather strange for anyone to buy into Putin's propaganda there. Where he's dealing with something, someone who's not aggressive to him. And it's, the whole thing is very. I mean, I can understand. The people say you don't poke a bear, that type of thing, but still, nonetheless, the level of aggression and the sheer horror that we haven't seen anything like this in Europe for a long time.
That is true. This definitely is it takes us way back, even but much before the era that we're discussing.
And Ukraine, Ukraine is a place that has a strong place in the Frum world, and in the Hasidic world, Uman and Mezhbush and Berdichev, and all of these towns, and I've been there. I've been to all of those places personally. And it's a beautiful country, and so it's also, I think, it hits home in a way that when we hear about Afghanistan or Iraq, which is also horrific, and this but we don't hear about the constant fighting in Pakistan, between Pakistan and India, which has been going on for a long time, and we never hear anything about it.
You're right. In many ways, we're ethnocentric, and somehow this means that much. Just to wrap things up here, I think that part of, we go back to even other films like that I've praised before, like Ninochka, which also really dealt with, there is this sense that the Russians, and maybe even the Ukrainians, despite the thousands of miles of distance, there still is a lot of commonality.
I think one thing about Ninotchka is that it shows it shows the emptiness of the communists, how they're all trying to convince themselves
Right.
of
But
something
I
that
think what
isn't.
Ninochka does is really give you a tremendous sympathy for the Russian people. And I think that's something
Exactly.
which I think something that again I this
Which
pro this
I'm saying, it shows that the people are the victims of this ideology, and they don't
right
really
right
believe it. They're trying to convince themselves that
okay, but the program, our program, the Projectionist is really not a, we're not trying to get on our soapbox, although I appreciate your passion here. But I think one thing we could say, and I think this could be true about almost, all the films that we mentioned, in some ways, is that, the people are quite similar. And therefore, I think it's wrong to demonize Russian citizens here because they don't necessarily renounce their citizenship and say, oh, like, join the anti-Putin forces. I mean,
absolutely.
these are just Russian actors or Russian people in the ballet or a Russian person. It's very difficult to go out there and strip yourself from your country and to denounce your country.
Yeah, I don't blame them for that, and I think that's also I agree with you that it's horrific to blame them.
And many of these people have been they've thrown them out, they've canceled their visas. The backlash, I think, it's done in such the way we're reacting to it, I think in many ways is primitive. And I think these films that we're suggesting, I think, could really perhaps tell us some of the folly of and how in some ways the people are somewhat the same. It's not to excuse the evil that's done by the masters who are in control, but
we do talk about television. The series Hogan's Heroes, I think, in a certain way brings that idea out. You're dealing with the Nazis, but showing them as bumbling, as foolish, as all kinds, whatever we're presenting them as, but also it humanizes them, and the irony of Jewish.
It's a program that, okay, we're really getting into here's where I think there's a line of demarcation that needs to be put into the sand here. Even though it might be true that there were just a number of Germans who didn't really know what was going on and perhaps can just be like Colonel Klink or Schultz. I think the idea
by a Yid. That's the irony.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, and Klink was also a Yid.
Yeah.
They were both Jews. The point I'm trying to make is that I think it's when the sheer enormity of the Holocaust, and Chaplin said the same thing. He said he would not have made The Great Dictator had he known about the extent of the Nazi horror. So to have a film about a concentration camp where the Americans are having a good time and somehow escaping and coming back, and it might have been true that in some ways they weren't all so bad, and there was sort of an understanding. But I think there was necessary, and maybe it still is, to recognize how terrible what the Nazis' plan was, and the Nazi ideas, and in ways that, despite what Stalin and others have done in Russia, the mass murders, somehow we doesn't really necessarily apply to the terrible things that were done in the name of communism. I think there's still. But this way,
there's definitely a demarcation that Nazism. There's a reason why Nazism is more of an archetype of evil than.
And I think it still needs to be perceived that way, despite the subtlety that is there. And again, one could make the case, which many have, that if you look in totality from the rise of communism through perestroika, that more people were killed and more were sent and lives were destroyed. More of Jews lost their identity and through timoyon and assimilation. And all that is true. But I think it's the intensity of the Nazi period in its brevity and it's an extreme total desire to annihilate
That's a point I've never thought of, because I've often pondered this point, but you make an excellent point there, that if the Nazi regime had lasted as long as the communist regime, it would have been much worse. It would have been. They would have gotten their final solution. That would have,
and again, world domination to a point that would have remade the planet, in a way that, as Philip K. Dick, sort of, conceived of. So look, as we've gotten on our soapbox here, we will probably leave that for next time. Take care, everybody. Watch your step on the way out. We'll catch you next time. Be well.
Thanks for joining us for another episode from the Yeshiva of Newark at IDT Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss a single episode.